and welcome to Bloomberg Quint. You're watching the Fineprint. Tech giants like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Alibaba, LinkedIn and other such digital companies derive value from a large user base. For instance, some digital companies sell user data for targeted advertising. It's this value that nations now want to tax. Europe has proposed a tax on turnover. Australia is contemplating a tax on digital advertising. Singapore has announced a sales tax on digital services starting 2020. India isn't far behind either. Digital advertising on foreign platforms is already under the tax net, commonly known as the equalization levy. But now, India wants to tax the business profits of digital companies as well. How should the government go about it? The tax department has asked this question to stakeholders and we went looking for some answers. 2 years ago, the government imposed a 6% tax on digital advertising. This tax is attracted when an Indian resident or a non-resident with a fixed place of business in India advertises online with a service provider that has no permanent establishment in India. Permanent establishment is tax language for a fixed place of business. This levy is applicable if the transaction value exceeds 1 lakh in a financial year. Reportedly, this levy has added close to 3,000 crores to the tax collections.
Currently, the base which has been defined in equalization levy, largely advertisement revenues, I think that part has worked very well, it's pretty clear. And I must say that, the administration of this levy seems to have gone off very smoothly. I haven't heard of any major controversy around it.
So to be clear, it is basically a B2B transaction that is attracting this equalization levy.
That's a great point. That's right.
Can I simplify this a little to try and understand again what kind of transactions attract this equalization levy? Let's say I'm advertising with Facebook, okay? I'm sure there is a Facebook India entity and there is, let's say, Facebook US, right? What kind of advertising would then attract equalization levy? Who should I be paying that money to?
So it's only the that, as you said, it's B2B. It's only where a company is paying for advertisements on Facebook in your example, but not me as a consumer or an end user of Facebook.
No, of course not. I'm saying I'm a business. Let's say I'm making jewelry, okay? And I want to advertise on Facebook.
So on that advertising revenue is where you will be obliged to discharge the equalization levy. And by the way, the law also has taken care to ensure non-double taxation. To say in this example, on that income there is no tax then in the hands of the non-resident once equalization levy is discharged. So it is a proxy for any kind of income tax liability leviable on the concerned company.
But this is a B2B transaction tax. This year's budget made way for the government to get its fair share of tax from B2C transactions as well by introducing the concept of significant economic presence. As the finance minister explained, the idea is to tax business profits of those digital businesses that do not have a physical presence in India, but they derive a significant economic value from India.
India's belief is that we follow strict source-based rules of taxation. Our domestic law and our treaty definitions of permanent establishment has lost its relevance. They've lost its relevance partly because of the digital invasion and partly because of new forms of business models that are coming up. For example, all foreign luxury good and garment manufacturers do not need to have a presence in India. You can actually use a Amazon platform and order those goods, or you can actually go into the websites of those companies and order those goods. It's very much prevalent practice amongst young people that before the H&Ms and the Zaras of the world came into India, that they used to go onto their laptops and order the latest Zara products. Now the question is, you can't tax those activities in India because assuming that they don't have presence in India, these shops. Now under this significant economic presence, those activities will come within the range.
India is not alone in this endeavor. Recently, the European Union proposed an interim and long-term plan to tax the digital economy. In the interim, the EU wants to introduce a 3% tax on revenues derived from online advertising, sale of user data, and online marketplaces. Businesses with EU digital revenues of over 50 million euros and total global revenues of over 750 million euros will come under this tax net. In the long term, EU wants digital companies to pay tax in each member state if any one of these thresholds is met. Digital services revenue exceeds 7 million euros, or number of users exceed 1 lakh, or number of online business contracts exceed 3,000.
First, let's understand why has the EU come out with this proposal. One are the political reasons. There is a civil society movement in certain parts of Europe where the common man believes that many of these digital companies are getting taxed, are not getting taxed. And as a result of that, there is immense amount of pressure on the politicians. That's one part of it. Second, let's look at the BEPS Action Point 1 on digital taxation, which under the inclusive framework has EU, OECD, non-OECD, emerging markets, everyone. Now there are several holes that you can pick up even in the final report of Action Point 1. For example, that report does identify the areas of tax leakages. It does identify the potential for tax collection by various governments. It also identifies the challenges for taxpayers insofar as the levy. So it does not tend to answer
It lists
how and
problems,
when.
yeah, but it doesn't really give the solutions.
Correct. Now, how and when will it be answered? Hopefully, the BEPS action point will take its own time. But because of this public pressure and because of some unilateral measures that were taken by countries such as Italy, the EU felt that in order to achieve some degree of harmonization across the European Union, France and Germany and Spain and Italy led the initiative, and they came out with this EU directive.
There are two additional aspects here. One is that the digital service tax, which is proposed by the European Commission, as you rightly said, is proposed as an interim measure, pending the introduction of what they call a spatial digital presence related attribution in future. Now that speaks to what India has proposed in the last budget by way of spatial economic presence definition in the Indian tax laws. One major difference appears to be that the language and even the word uses economic presence, not just digital. So the language seems to be far more overarching in the Indian legislation.
The reason you're pointing out that what we're intending to do or tax is a relatively far larger universe of services is because the CBDT has sought consultation on the revenue threshold of transaction in respect of physical goods or services carried by a non-resident in India.
That's right.
So what is this group of businesses then that we are hoping to tax?
So entire supply chain, actually if you really see theoretically or in principle, as I said, the way it is worded, so whether it is a B2B transaction of importation of goods,
currently on which you're only paying customs duty.
You are paying only customs duty. Any kind of supply chain, EPC contracts, manufacturing, services, you name it. The entire supply chain, as I call it, for any business in India, wherever there is importation in that supply chain from vendors who do not have a presence in India, potentially can come under this if that is the way the language remains.
How many businesses will there be who will not have, let's say, a business connection in India already, and they're just
there would be many.
import market?
There would be many, because there are so many small and medium businesses all over the world who export to India, particularly in the B2B market. All of them don't necessarily have a presence in it.
And that's where CBDT's consultation on revenue thresholds becomes important. The tax department wants stakeholders to weigh in on revenue threshold of transaction involving physical goods or services, revenue threshold for digital goods or services transactions, and threshold for number of digital users.
That's a matter of further study and research in terms of what would constitute a significant base in India, given the size of India's population as well and users as well, right? As you rightly said, the European Commission has recommended certain thresholds, which signify significant, digital presence, and also ensure that relatively smaller businesses indulging in digital commerce do not have a undue burden. So it's for India to say that, okay, what should be that threshold. As I said earlier, in another matter of CBCR, we adopted the revenue threshold which the OECD had recommended. We can equally adopt what the EU has recommended as an example. But I think the greater challenge in my view will be the attribution.
I was coming
profit.
to that, because how easy will it be to figure out, how many users of, let's say, this digital entity are from India, and only that part could be monetized, and then we want to go ahead and tax it. So how will this attribution work?
It's a very pertinent question. It is going to be far more difficult, I feel, for India or for any other country to simply implement a PE attribution, because of the fact that the other parts of the data, which is about users in other countries, for example, revenues collected in other countries arising from user data in India, right, and so many other data points are obviously spread out, and India is outside the EU, is outside the US system, so all of that is not easily available. Yes, we will have exchange of information, etc., under the exchange of information clauses, but it is too simplistic to assume that a simple formula can be worked out by each country to tax that element. So what India has currently are two provisions. One is Rule 10, which is a very conventional ad hoc apportionment formula which has been there in the law for a long time to determine what could be deemed attribution for Indian taxation. And then of course India introduced transfer pricing rules. So we have the arm's length principle, which is available in principle or in theory to tax such transactions. So we have these two methods currently. What could be an additional method or a modulation of that, only time will tell for when it comes to digital commerce. But let's just dwell upon these two. Rule 10 essentially says that revenues from India divided by global revenues multiplied by global profits should be the taxable base in India, which in a bricks and mortar sense itself posed enough challenges. And imagine in a digital business sense, it would be almost impossible to apply these formulas because of their very definition, right? So that does not seem to be the answer. Arm's length principle, yes, in theory that would be the answer, because it is based on functions, assets and risks. Except one essential element in digital commerce, as we know, is potentially complete lack of people involvement in the host country. So one big element of that attribution is missing because there are no people in India. So in one way, if the entire functions and the contractual, legal, economic risks are outside of India, under attribution rules it can actually escape taxation, because there is no presence in India as defined by those three criteria.
Attribution is just one of the issues. Amending the tax treaties is going to be a challenge as well.
When the law was legislated as a part of the 2018 budget, it clearly said that India is proposing this law in order to be prepared for the changes that will occur in the double tax treaties. So in a way, by coming out with subordinate legislation, you're not going to be able to address those categories of non-resident taxpayer with whom India has double tax treaties. Our treaty network is very wide. So in a way, I feel that this is a bit premature for us, having stated the objective in the 2018 budget. But if those objectives are in any manner getting diluted, and we are trying to say that our domestic law is going to override the treaties, then this makes sense. Otherwise, this is, in my view, a very academic exercise.
But academic exercise apart, but negotiating and reworking these treaties is not going to be an easy task, right? So how do you bring those transactions, and do you wait for all those treaties to be renegotiated?
No, the treaties won't be renegotiated. The way it is going to work is that we have the Action Point 1 report with us with regard to digital taxation.
You're talking about the OECD report.
That's right.
Right.
Now, these are going to trigger off changes to the tax treaties provided bilateral treaty partners agree on those specific clauses.
Yeah, this would be via that multilateral instrument.
That's right.
But then you need to make sure that your treaty partner, like you said, has also signed up for that.
So these changes will get triggered off through the multilateral instruments, which means two nations will have to come together and agree to it and use the OECD as a depository. If one country does not agree to it, those changes in the treaty will not get triggered off. Which means you're looking at a likely scenario where some treaties will trigger off a digital PE, some treaties will not. And hence my question is, how is a change in the domestic law going to affect any of the taxable positions under these treaties?
The challenges relating to attribution and treaties is perhaps why the OECD hasn't been able to come up with a concrete solution to tax digital businesses. And it's this delay that perhaps explains the anxiousness of countries to bring digital businesses to tax. Back home, the window for consultation on significant economic presence is open till August 10th, and it doesn't look like India is keen to wait for OECD solution. Thank you for joining us on The Fine Print. We'll see you next week.